Hello everyone, it's Dr. Rafael Gutierrez. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about trench foot. The reason is it was brought up to me in a class. Someone wanted to know what it was. And the reason it was brought up is because we do have trench warfare happening now in Ukraine. It's also winter is coming there, and so you're going to have a lot of different conditions come up. Now, a lot of people will mention frostbite. Frostbite is horrible, and it is, due to cold temperatures. Trench foot's a little different. Trench foot is actually, well, the diagnosis is no longer called trench foot. It's called immersion foot syndrome, and it has to deal with your feet being wet for a prolonged period of time. Now, the original name trench foot did come from World War I, but the same condition has been described a while before that. Pretty much, again, the idea is feet get wet, they stay wet for a long time, it doesn't get cold enough to freeze, but the wet foot ends up having a lot of other issues. Now, the history, if we look at World War I, we can see that it's not just an inconvenience. What I ended up finding as I started looking at it is during World War I, British had about 888,000 deaths, depending on the number, where you get the numbers. And they had 75,000 deaths attributed just to trench foot. The U.S. military during World War I had about 117,000 deaths, and again, 2,000 deaths were from trench foot. So we're talking about between 1% and 2% of deaths were due to trench foot, not a battlefield injury such as a bullet wound, shrapnel, or even infection caused by that. We're talking about what ended up causing this death was prolonged exposure to water in the feet. Now, I, like many people, would have thought this was something that wasn't necessarily an issue in military. And so I actually looked at different research done on trench foot, and what I found is there was an article on British soldiers in the Falkland Wars where it came out to somewhere around 64% of the soldiers ended up having some degree of trench foot. This wasn't a death, but it was foot issues due to pretty much feet being exposed to water for prolonged periods of time in a boot. And then even more recently, I ended up finding one article that talked about how they ended up taking 400 soldiers who were on a field exercise, not war, but a field exercise, and of those 400, 149 developed trench foot. And so what I'm saying is, this isn't something that has stopped being an issue after World War I. It's still an issue. And again, it has to do with prolonged exposure to moisture in the feet. It doesn't just happen to soldiers. We actually see trench foot happen in athletes. A lot of times people who go hiking or camping a lot, they may actually not necessarily change their socks as often as they should. Their socks may get moist because of sweat, and then that sweat is enough to actually give them minor cases of trench foot. Now, people may think, oh, well, it's just, trench foot, no big deal. But again, remember, it can actually lead to deaths in some cases. And the symptoms really can be pretty detrimental. And remember, these are going to get worse. And if you have trench foot once, the next time you get it, it will actually be worse for you. So the symptoms are usually a tingling, a itching, pain, swelling, blister formations. Already you can see a problem. Imagine if you are in a battlefield and you have major blister formations, swelling, and pain in your feet. It makes moving quite a bit more difficult. And this can actually keep going. You can end up having the tissue die and fall off. And so that actually ends up leading to other problems. One of them is if tissues are dying and falling off, you now have a higher incidence of infections. And if you have an infection of the foot, it can actually end up destroying a life. You can end up leading to amputations. And so that's why trench foot is a subject that most people, especially those people who are in warfare right now, especially people who are in trenches, should take a look at. Now, the reason why it's called trench foot is because if you think of it a trench, especially during winter months or fall, where you have a lot of water falling, Water will go into the trenches and you will have fluid retention. If you're walking in this, your feet can get wet. And if your feet get wet and they stay long, well, there you get your trench foot. Now, there are ways to prevent this. The problem with the prevention is a lot of times people don't really think of it as an issue, and a lot of times it has to deal with having the right supplies. As the cause is having feet wet for a prolonged period of time, the best prevention is avoiding having your feet get wet. Again, if you're sweating, if you're in a trench, if you're exposed to a lot of water, not something you have an option to actually do. But there are things that can help prevent it. One of them is making sure you keep your feet clean. If you find yourself in a situation where your feet are constantly getting wet, every so often, make sure you clean your feet, dry them off properly, and check them. Make sure that you don't have any signs that you are starting to develop trench foot. If you're preventing it, it won't get worse. The other thing that's actually vital, and again, it's one of those things that it's easier said than done, is making sure you have clean socks you can change into every so often. Again, this is not something you can do every day sometimes. If you think about supply lines, not something that may actually be possible. But whenever possible, make sure you are wearing clean socks to avoid having the moisture accumulate and avoid having the possibility of trench feet. If you are one of the people who is involved in logistics, it would be a good idea to include clean socks as something that you would be sending to a frontline fighter, especially if they are in trenches, to make sure that your soldiers do not end up suffering from trench foot. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it actually helps save someone's life. Have a nice day.